My name is Sarah. I used to be Daddy's little girl, until I became the family's forgotten mistake. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Not in person, not through a phone call that might have carried even a thread of warmth or explanation. Just a crisp white envelope with the law firm's embossed letterhead, sitting in my mailbox like a polite executioner. Inside, typed in that cold, professional font that lawyers use to deliver life-altering news, were the words that would rewrite my entire understanding of who I was in this family. We regret to inform you that you are not named as a beneficiary in your father's trust. Not named. As if I had never existed at all. The paper trembled in my hands, and I read it again. And again. Surely there was a mistake. Surely someone had mixed up the paperwork, confused me with someone else. But there it was, in black and white. My brother Michael would inherit the family home where we'd spent every Christmas morning, every birthday party, every milestone celebration. My sister Rebecca would receive the stock portfolio that Dad had carefully built over decades. The one he used to joke would keep us all comfortable someday. And me? I got nothing. Not even a token gesture. Not even an acknowledgement that I had ever mattered. I called my mother immediately, my fingers shaking as I dialed her number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before she picked up with her usual cheerful, "Hello, sweetheart." But when I started to speak, when I began to ask about the letter, about the trust, about why my name wasn't there, her voice changed. It became distant, careful, like she was speaking to a stranger who might be recording the conversation. "Your father made his decisions," she said simply. "I'm sure he had his reasons." His reasons. As if 28 years of being his daughter, of Sunday morning pancakes and bedtime stories and proud smiles at my college graduation, could be distilled down to reasons that justified erasing me completely. Before we continue, drop a comment. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it there? I'd love to know how far this story is reaching. Sometimes the stories that hurt us most are the ones that connect us across miles and time zones. The funeral had been 3 months earlier. 3 months of walking through my grief like I was underwater. Everything muffled and strange. Dad had been sick for over a year, and I'd spent every weekend I could at his bedside, bringing him his favorite soup from the deli downtown, reading to him from the mystery novels he loved, holding his hand while he dozed. In those quiet moments, when it was just the two of us and the steady beep of the monitors, he would squeeze my fingers and tell me how proud he was of the woman I'd become. "You've got the strongest heart of all my children," he'd whispered. One Sunday afternoon, his voice barely audible over the hum of the oxygen machine. "Promise me you'll never let anyone dim that light of yours." I had promised. I had meant it. But now, sitting in my apartment with that letter in my lap, I wondered if he had already known what was coming. If those words had been some kind of preparation for this moment, this devastating discovery that his love for me hadn't been enough to secure my place in the family's future. The next family dinner was awkward in ways I couldn't have imagined. We gathered at Mom's house as we always did on the first Sunday of every month. Michael brought his wife and kids, Rebecca came with her latest boyfriend, and I sat at the same chair I'd occupied for years, feeling like an imposter at my own family's table. Nobody mentioned the trust. Nobody asked how I was handling the news. The conversation flowed around me like I was a stone in a stream, present but irrelevant, something to navigate around rather than engage with. When Rebecca talked about her plans to invest some of her inheritance in a new business venture, Michael nodded approvingly and offered advice. When Michael mentioned renovations he wanted to make to the house, Mom smiled and said Dad would have loved to see the improvements. And when I tried to contribute to the conversation, when I attempted to share news about my promotion at work or the volunteer program I'd started, their responses were polite, but distant, perfunctory, like they were humoring a guest who'd overstayed their welcome. I excused myself early that night, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely a lie. My head did hurt, from the effort of pretending everything was normal, from swallowing the questions and accusations that kept rising in my throat like bile. "Drive safe," Mom called after me as I gathered my coat and purse. But she didn't hug me goodbye, didn't ask when I'd see her again. For the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger in the house where I'd grown up. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of confusion and hurt. I found myself analyzing every interaction I'd had with my father in his final months, searching for clues about what I might have done wrong. Had I said something that offended him? Had I failed him somehow when he needed me most? The questions circled in my mind like vultures, picking at the carcass of my self-worth. I stopped checking the family group chat as frequently. The messages continued without me. Photos from Rebecca's weekend trips, updates about the grandkids from Michael, Mom sharing articles about recipes and local events. But my contributions, when I made them, seemed to disappear into the void. No responses, no acknowledgements, no hearts or thumbs-up reactions that used to pepper our digital conversations. It was as if I was slowly being erased, one ignored message at a time. Work became my refuge. I threw myself into my job at the nonprofit, staying late to organize fundraising events, volunteering for weekend community outreach programs, anything to keep my mind occupied and my hands busy. My colleagues noticed the change in my dedication, and my supervisor, Janet, pulled me aside one afternoon to commend my recent performance. "Whatever's motivating you lately, keep it up," she said with a warm smile. "You've been absolutely invaluable to this organization." Invaluable. The word hit me like a physical blow because it was everything my family had decided I wasn't. Here, among people who weren't bound to me by blood or obligation, I mattered. My contributions were recognized, my efforts appreciated, my presence valued. But late at night, alone in my apartment with nothing but the hum of the refrigerator for company, the hurt would creep back in. I would remember Dad's hands, so gentle when he braided my hair before school. I would think about the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed at my terrible jokes. I would recall the pride in his voice when he introduced me to his friends as my daughter Sarah, the one who's going to change the world. Had all of that been pretense? Had I misread every moment of affection, every expression of love? Or had something changed in those final weeks? Something that turned his love into indifference, his pride into disappointment? I started avoiding family gatherings altogether. When Mom's birthday came around, I sent a card and flowers but declined the invitation to dinner. When Michael's oldest daughter had her school play, I sent my regrets and a gift card. Each missed event felt like another small death, another severing of the ties that had once bound us together. The isolation was suffocating, but it was also oddly liberating. Without the constant ache of trying to fit into a family that no longer seemed to want me, I began to rediscover parts of myself that I'd forgotten existed. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since college. I joined a book club at the local library, where strangers became friends over shared stories and strong coffee. And slowly, quietly, I began to build a life that didn't revolve around seeking approval from people who had already decided I wasn't worth their consideration. It was during one of my weekend trips to Dad's favorite used bookstore that I found it. I was browsing through his beloved mystery section, running my fingers along the spines of books he used to recommend to me, when I noticed one volume that looked different from the others. It was an old edition of Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep, and tucked between its pages was an envelope with my name written across it in Dad's careful handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in his familiar script. My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, it means you found what I hoped you would find. I've been watching you these past months, seeing the woman you've become, and I am so incredibly proud. You have inherited the best parts of your mother and me, her compassion, my stubborn streak, and a sense of justice that burns bright in both our families. I know the family situation has been difficult lately. I know there are tensions and misunderstandings that I haven't handled as well as I should have. But I want you to know, without any doubt, that you are deeply trusted by me to continue what I believe in. You are the one who will carry forward the values that matter most: kindness, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Whatever happens with the legal papers and the official documents, remember that the most important things can't be written down in a will or trust. They live in your heart, in your actions, in the way you treat people who can't do anything for you in return. You already have the greatest inheritance I could give you. You have become the person I always hoped you would be. Keep fighting the good fight, sweetheart. The world needs more people like you. All my love, Dad. I stood in that bookstore aisle and cried. Not the bitter tears of abandonment I'd been shedding for months, but tears of recognition, of vindication, of a love that transcended legal documents and family politics. This letter wasn't a will or a trust amendment that would hold up in court, but it was something far more valuable. Proof that I hadn't imagined our connection, that the love I'd felt from him had been real and reciprocated. For the first time, since receiving that cold letter from the law firm, I felt like I could breathe fully. But the letter also raised new questions, darker possibilities that I hadn't wanted to consider. If Dad had felt this way about me, if he'd trusted me above all others to carry on his values, then why wasn't I included in the trust? Who had made that decision? And when? And most importantly, why had no one thought to tell me? I began to wonder if the man who had written this loving letter was the same man who had signed the trust documents. The timeline didn't make sense. Dad had been sick for over a year, but this letter felt recent, urgent, like something written by someone who knew time was running out but still had clarity of mind and purpose. Something wasn't right. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a spark of the fighting spirit Dad had always said I inherited from his side of the family. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in October. I received notice of it almost by accident, a brief mention in a letter about estate tax implications that I probably wasn't supposed to receive. According to the paperwork, it was SAO, a routine proceeding to finalize the trust distribution, and my presence wasn't required or expected. But something told me to be there anyway. Maybe it was Dad's voice in my head, urging me to keep fighting the good fight. Maybe it was my own need for closure, for some kind of understanding about how and why my life had been turned upside down. Or maybe it was simply the stubborn streak Dad had mentioned in his letter, the refusal to go quietly into the background of my own family's story. I arrived at the courthouse 15 minutes early, dressed in the navy blue suit I wore to important work meetings. I wanted to look professional, composed, unbreakable, even if I felt like I was held together with nothing more than determination and caffeine. The hallway outside the courtroom was filled with the usual mix of lawyers in expensive suits and families in various states of grief and tension. I saw them before they saw me. Mom, Michael, and Rebecca stood clustered near the courtroom doors, speaking in hushed tones with their attorney, a tall man with silver hair who gestured emphatically as he spoke. When Rebecca finally noticed me approaching, her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and something that might have been guilt. "Sarah," Mom said, her voice carefully neutral. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I thought I should be," I replied, matching her tone. "Dad was my father, too." Michael stepped forward, and for a moment I thought he might try to send me away. But something in my posture, or maybe the way I held his gaze without flinching, made him think better of it. Instead, he just nodded curtly and turned his attention back to the lawyer. We filed into the courtroom in silence. I chose a seat in the back, close enough to hear everything but far enough away to maintain the distance that had become our new normal. The proceedings began with the usual legal formalities: the reading of documents, the verification of identities, the methodical march through probate law that reduces a human life to assets and distributions. I listened as the lawyer presented the trust documents, outlining the distribution of Dad's estate. The house to Michael, valued at $850,000. The stock portfolio to Rebecca, worth approximately $1.2 million. Various smaller bequests to charities and distant relatives. And then, silence where my name should have been. The judge reviewed the documents with the practiced efficiency of someone who had presided over hundreds of similar proceedings. Everything seemed to be moving according to script, a careful choreography of legal procedures that would make permanent my exclusion from the family's financial future. But then something unexpected happened. "I'd like to call Mrs. Eleanor Watson to speak regarding her role as backup trustee," the judge announced, consulting his notes. I had forgotten about Mrs. Watson. She had been Dad's closest friend since childhood. The woman who had been my honorary aunt for as long as I could remember. She had spoken at his funeral with tears streaming down her face, talking about their 60-year friendship and the man she had known better than almost anyone. Mrs. Watson rose from her seat in the middle of the courtroom, and I was struck by how frail she looked. She was 83 years old, and Dad's death had aged her visibly. But when she spoke, her voice carried the same strength and clarity I remembered from my childhood. "Your Honor," she began, "I need to share something that's been weighing on my conscience since Robert's passing." The room seemed to hold its breath. I could see Mom's shoulders tense, could hear Michael shift uncomfortably in his seat. "I was asked to serve as backup trustee for Robert's estate," Mrs. Watson continued. "And in that capacity, I was given copies of the trust documents to review approximately 1 year ago. At that time, the trust included provisions for all 3 of Robert's children, Michael, Rebecca, and Sarah." My heart stopped. All 3 children. 1 year ago. I advised Robert on the structure of the trust, helped him understand the tax implications and distribution options. We spent several afternoons going over the details, and he was very clear about his intentions. He wanted to provide for all of his children equally, with some variations based on their individual circumstances and needs. Mrs. Watson paused, her eyes finding mine across the courtroom. In that moment, I saw recognition, understanding, and something that looked like an apology. If there was a subsequent modification to remove Sarah from the trust, I was not consulted about it. And knowing Robert as I did, knowing his love for all of his children, I find that strange. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Strange. Such a mild word to describe something so devastating, so incomprehensible. "Can you elaborate on what you mean by strange, Mrs. Watson?" the judge asked, leaning forward with obvious interest. "Robert spoke about Sarah frequently during our planning sessions," she replied, her voice growing stronger. "He was proud of her work with underprivileged communities, proud of the values she embodied. He specifically mentioned wanting to ensure she would have the financial security to continue her charitable work without worrying about making ends meet. The Robert I knew would not have cut her out of his will without explanation." I could hear whispers starting around the courtroom. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Mom's face go pale. Rebecca was staring down at her hands, and Michael had gone very still. "Furthermore," Mrs. Watson continued, "in the final weeks of Robert's life, when his illness had progressed significantly, I noticed that he was having difficulty with complex cognitive tasks. He struggled to remember recent conversations, became confused about dates and appointments. While he remained loving and present emotionally, I questioned whether he was in a condition to make major legal decisions during that period." The judge made notes as she spoke, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. "Mrs. Watson," he said finally, "are you suggesting that undue influence may have been exerted over Mr. Thompson during the revision of his trust documents?" "I'm saying that the version of the trust I reviewed does not match the version being presented today, and I believe this court should investigate how and why those changes were made." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, could sense the careful facade my family had constructed beginning to crumble. The judge set down his pen and looked directly at the family attorney. "Counselor, I'm going to need to see all versions of Mr. Thompson's trust documents, along with documentation of when each revision was made and who was present during the signing. "Your Honor," the attorney began, but the judge cut him off with a raised hand. "Furthermore, I'm ordering a formal investigation into the circumstances surrounding the final revision of this trust. This proceeding is suspended pending the outcome of that investigation." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through my chest. As people began to file out of the courtroom, I remained in my seat, trying to process what had just happened. Mrs. Watson made her way over to me, moving slowly but with purpose. "Sarah, dear," she said, taking my hand in both of hers. "I should have spoken up sooner. I've been carrying this burden since the funeral, knowing something wasn't right, but not wanting to cause more pain during an already difficult time." "Thank you," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth." She squeezed my hand. "Your father loved you deeply, sweetheart. Whatever happened in those final weeks, whatever influenced those changes, it didn't come from his heart. The Robert I knew would have moved heaven and earth to protect you." I watched my family leave the courtroom without looking back at me. Mom's steps were hesitant, uncertain, while Michael and Rebecca flanked her like protective guards. For the first time in months, I felt something shift in the power dynamic that had governed our relationship since Dad's death. The investigation that followed took 3 months. 3 months of depositions and document reviews, of expert testimony about Dad's mental state in his final weeks, of uncomfortable truths slowly surfacing like debris after a storm. What emerged was a picture of a man whose cognitive abilities had been compromised by medication and illness, who had been vulnerable to pressure from family members concerned about their own financial security. The original trust, the one Mrs. Watson had reviewed, had indeed included me as an equal beneficiary. The revision that cut me out had been signed during a period when Dad's attending physician later testified he would not have been competent to make such decisions. But perhaps more damaging than the legal findings were the personal revelations that came to light. Phone records showed dozens of calls between Mom and the family attorney in Dad's final weeks. Email exchanges revealed conversations about protecting the family assets and concerns about my unstable lifestyle. A reference apparently to my choice to work in nonprofit rather than pursuing a more lucrative career. I learned that my absence from family gatherings hadn't been accidental oversight. It had been deliberate exclusion, orchestrated by family members who had already decided I didn't deserve a place at the table. The truth, when it finally emerged completely, was both vindication and heartbreak. I had been right to trust my instincts, right to believe that Dad's love for me had been real and enduring. But I also had to confront the reality that the people I had called family for 28 years had been willing to erase me from Dad's legacy for their own financial gain. When the court ruled in my favor, reinstating me as a beneficiary of the original trust, I felt no triumph. Only a deep, aching sadness for what we had all lost in the process. Money could be redistributed, assets could be divided, but trust, that precious, fragile thing that binds families together, could not be restored by judicial decree. Mom called me the day after the ruling was announced. Her voice was small, defeated, nothing like the confident woman who had raised me. "Sarah," she said, "I need you to know that I never meant for things to go this far. I was scared, confused, grieving. I made terrible decisions, and I hurt you in ways I'll never be able to repair." I listened in silence, feeling the weight of her words, but also the impossibility of simply accepting them and moving forward as if nothing had happened. "I don't know if you can ever forgive me," she continued, "but I want you to know that I love you. I have always loved you, even when I lost sight of what that love should look like." "I know you love me, Mom," I replied finally. "But love without respect, without basic consideration for my dignity and worth, that's not enough anymore. I can't go back to being the daughter who accepts scraps of affection and calls it family." The silence that followed was filled with the weight of everything we had lost and everything that could never be recovered. I used part of my inheritance to expand the nonprofit's community outreach programs, creating a fund specifically designed to help families navigate legal challenges they couldn't afford to fight on their own. Dad would have approved, I think. He always believed that privilege came with responsibility, that those who had been given much should give much in return. I also bought a small house on the other side of town, far enough from the family home to feel like a fresh start, but close enough to the places that held my best memories of Dad. In the garden behind the house, I planted the same flowers he had grown in his backyard: sunflowers and roses, delphiniums and sweet peas, plants that would bloom year after year, carrying forward something beautiful from the past into whatever future I was building for myself. Mrs.